Now is with us Professor Erik Stenberg. Erik is Associate Professor at the School of Architecture of the Royal Institute of Technology, the KTH, in Stockholm, Sweden. So, Erik.
Okay, thank you for inviting me to the symposium. I would like to give you a little bit of a history of Swedish housing and talk about the future perspective of the past housing. So I will start with this curve, and today I will speak about these two bumps. And I will begin with this bump. This is a 150-year perspective in housing in Sweden, starting with 1915 on the left-hand side. And we are currently somewhere here, and then stretching all the way to 2065. And in this perspective, I would like to talk about this increase of the curve. The blue line is multifamily housing being built year by year in the 10s, 20, 30, 40, 50, up to 100,000 per year. And the red line is if you add single family housing. So the total production of housing in from 1945 to 1975 almost increased from 40,000 to over 100,000 units per year. And this increase in production was also coupled to the increase of quality of housing. So I would like to dwell a little bit on this aspect. And a couple of statistics that might help here is that at the beginning or at the end of World War II in 1945, there was, of course, an increase in the urbanization in Sweden. And as the cities grew, there was a need for housing. There was a housing shortage. And there was a 15-year period before 1945 when all of the studies were done in order to understand the problem from a technical, financial, social, architectural perspective. And then there was a continued increase in production over a 30-year period. And then there was a sharp drop of production from this almost 80,000 units a year to less than 20,000 units in multifamily housing. And this was, of course, because the rapid changes in society, the globalization first crisis, which was the OPEC oil crisis, or the student revolt in Paris, 1968, which radically changed the modern project. And then there was a long period of almost nothing, where the modern project was discussed and critiqued. And now we're entering into a second stage of a housing shortage in the Swedish country or environment. So this is a catalog from 1967, and it says a social crane. A social crane meant, for example, that in the period from 1950 to 1965, the manual labor was completely mechanized. So 90% of all cement and concrete and brick that was carried onto a building site was carried by manual labor in 1950. By the end of 1965, 5% was carried by manual labor. And that's why the crane was also a social project in order to both free the heavy labor from the builder, but also to increase production. Because if the laborer could be removed from the physical labor, then they could also work longer. So instead of retiring with a broken body at 40, they could work till 60, 65. And therefore, the increase in production without an increase in workforce from 1950 to 1965 was about 60%. So with the same workforce, we could produce 60% more housing units. And this is, in fact, lifting the lives of people into a new society. So the crane was the symbol of the mechanization of this social welfare project. And this is where you see the, which is now not uncommon. You go to a building site and you see 8 people standing around and you think they're lazy. But this is actually something good on a building site because they're not breaking their bodies. And so you see those 3 guys standing and looking at the crane, doing the work, lifting the panel, putting it into place. And as mechanization was propelled, there was also an increase in the prefabrication and ultimately panel building process, which attempted to increase also the quality within the building. So this is one of the first panel buildings built in Sweden in 1966, where an old building construction company attempted to move into the panel construction in order to rationalize and to increase production. And they were very clear on presenting the interior effects also of what they were doing. So this is one example presenting the 2 plans below and the lives of the people inside. And remember, this is a society that just 50 years before these images were presented, over 80% were living on farms in a rural condition. So this was a rapid urbanization, an increase of the household economy, and of course the quality of life and the welfare. And you can see this is a load-bearing column system, which allows for different configurations. And this was the construction company's attempt to accommodate both a static panel building and a changing society. And they were very active also on the political scene, making full-page ads in the paper, inviting all people to come and make comments about this new building, and they would deliver it to the Prime Minister Olof Palme to try to change the laws also. This is the typical apartment. So during the period 1965 to 1974, 1 million units of housing were built in Sweden, which is still 1/4 almost of Sweden's total housing stock. So during 10 years, almost 1/4 of Sweden's housing was built. And it was primarily industrialized, standardized, modularized, repetitive, fairly uniform, and based on the nuclear family. And the nuclear family was to live in one of these apartments, which was a 72 square meter called Type 72 of the system Skarner 66. And the 66 is because that's the year it was developed. And it's a load-bearing exterior wall system with a column, with a load-bearing column in the center. It was based on 4 precast plates placed on each column on the exterior walls, and even the interior walls were prefabricated and just attached to the ceiling with a wooden molding and then some screws, keeping it in tension. And this was the most highly mechanized prefabricated system of the time. And they wrote in the material from the 60s, they wrote another point: on the long run, houses need to stand at least 50 years. If you want to, maybe the year 2000, you can change the interior of the house and redesign the old framework so that it fits the standard for the year 2000. So this is the future perspective of the concrete panel systems. They further developed this system in a low-rise housing area south of Stockholm, and this was called Orminge, where they also had the mechanized, the cranes were also on wheels, so they could be moved around instead of on rails. This is one example of different housing configurations from that project. A family with 2 kids, a family with 4 kids, or a family with 4 kids in a different configuration. And the idea here was, of course, to accommodate a family through its different stages from a young couple to old age. But we have found that in the 50-year perspective, this is maybe more interesting to accommodate globalization and different family structures and the breakdown of the nuclear family. So this flexibility is actually more welcome today than it was in the 60s when it was built. This is the builder, Allan Skarner, and I've had the fortune to look through some of the old notes and materials that he produced, and one speech that I found he held in 1962 to the journalists. There was a journalist conference in Sweden. He said that his interest is the future of housing. And his quote here says, planning for the next tomorrow in order to build something tomorrow. So his intent was always to plan for the future, but to build tomorrow. And what he lists here is a number of issues that he wants to contribute in the building. And it's interesting that at first he writes more space. And one of the most troubling problems of urbanization in Sweden was overcrowding. So at the turn of the century, in the 10s and 20s and 30s, most families were maybe sharing a 1-room apartment with another family. So in the 40s and 50s, we built a number of 1-bedroom apartments, so we could increase space, increase production, and therefore free space for the families. And then in the 60s and 70s, we could build 2-bedroom, 72 square meter apartments for most families. But he still saw that the future will hold that we need more space, better heating systems, better plans, more storage, better kitchens, more electrical outlets, which is interesting now that we need to load to charge our iPhones and look for outlets all over the place. So he has a list of things, but towards the end, he makes this note in reference to the question that was asked in the previous section. He says that we have to be clear that the housing that we build today will be ready to be rebuilt or reconstructed sometime in the coming 20 or 30s, which means the year 2020 or 2030. And so this period of panel building, which was extremely short-lived and highly criticized for being uniform, gray, and boring, from the building perspective, was highly foresightful and adaptive. And this, I think, is the kind of turn, the weird twist of history in terms of modernism and panel building. So the second part is a little bit shorter. This is now taking that we have 1/4 of Swedish housing that was built at this time period. What do we do with them now that we have them? Society has changed radically. The norms of urban life have shifted. The quality of most aspects of society have changed. We have introduced some big phenomena such as globalization, which I mentioned, digitalization, and obviously we have the environmental issues. I think we are lucky in Sweden that most of the prefabricated housing and most of the housing built during the Million Program era performs fairly well, energy-wise, but not socially. So we have a problem where we have to deal with the historical buildings as existing entities, and we have managed to steer away from the Soviet discussion of demolishing to refurbishing. So what I want to present is a few examples of what students have done in courses that we have looked at, and that we have investigated other systems than Olsson and Skarner that are also flexible. This is one called Norrköping, and Norrköping's byggelement was a highly regularized, modularized system based on the 3M module, and you probably know it as the IKEA module with 60 centimeter wide kitchen cabinets, and based on the 30 centimeter module having 90 centimeter high kitchen cabinets, etc. This whole building system is very tightly aligned to this 3M system, which gives it a flexibility. You can actually rearrange the interiors in a highly efficient or flexible manner over time. We've spent time with students also casting these panels in order to understand how they can be rearranged. We've looked also at the A system, which was developed in one area of Sweden as a system that actually had, in a way, standardized room sizes. Standardized room sizes that over time could change function. So if you look at this as one stairwell with today 3 apartments, and the 3 apartments are arranged around the core, but they could very easily be rearranged into, say, one very large apartment, because the rooms are of a standard size, not that you need to move the walls, but the rooms are of a standard size that could fit either a living room or a bedroom and a bathroom, or a hallway and a kitchen, or a kitchen and a small sleeping space. And so this is moving towards a general size, which is also closely related to the 3M module. So it also is easy to move around furniture. And this change, of course, deals also with ownership, who owns what, and how do we rearrange. But we are lucky to have still a high degree of municipal ownership. And the municipal ownership is not solely for what in other parts of the world are called social housing. We actually built middle-class housing and subsidized on rent. So even though we have lots of low-income families living in these apartments, they are not built with a lesser quality. So this is one panel from the A system. We've also looked at new conditions for the concrete. Here is the Skarner system that I mentioned earlier. Panels from the Skarner system. And the way that we are working with students is that if they get an understanding of the qualities from a different perspective than the societal critique of modernism, they find that they have very quickly find ways to develop the systems. So we break them down and we recreate them, and then in other courses we let the students look at material changes or developments. This, for example, is just a rendition of how one could super insulate one of these buildings without losing the sense of the panel building. This is a condition where you could add a few stories to one of these buildings. By understanding the structural systems, you could add another structural system on top. This is looking at extending them, probably inspired by Lacatona Vasal's work. This is a building on top of the house. This is an original condition that can be changed by adding pods on the exterior. This is outside of Gothenburg, where this is the original. And the municipal housing company just spent lots of money trying to, or renovating them, but they forgot to change the interiors to fit today's society. This is a proposal by a student of how they could actually develop the standard modules within the building to make an even more flexible and adaptable system to make up to 4 or 5 bedroom apartments within the same structure. And this is using the same building system but proposing a new building. So if we actually were to tear down and reuse some of the pieces, or if we were to cast them again, what could it look like? So this is one image of how the future could look. So to wrap up, we get back to the 2 bumps again. So we're in a condition where we have a housing crisis again, and everybody is talking about new construction. And new construction does not have a perspective maybe more than 10 or 20 years. And this is obviously going to be a huge problem if we construct just as many houses again and have to renovate them in 20 years. So I argue for using the previous bump, which needs to be renovated now, and to develop and to make them stand for another 50 or 100 years, instead of building new buildings that will last 20 or 40 years. Thank you.